The Invisible Man. That is a great poster, by the way, but do stay away from the trailer if you can. It's very spoilery. So, the background of how this film got made is tied, believe it or not, to Marvel Cinematic Universe. When other studios a couple years back saw what an enormous success that franchise was becoming, they decided they want to have cinematic universes of their own. Warner Brothers tried and spectacularly failed with DC Universe, although they seem to slowly be heading in the right direction with comic book movies that are more standalone. I'm looking at Wonder Woman and Shazam and Joker here. Universal Studios, on the other hand, didn't have any other huge comic book properties to work with, so what they did instead is they dug deep into their catalog from the early 20th century. From there, they pulled the old monsters like Dracula and Frankenstein and werewolves and said, we're doing this, and we're calling it the Dark Universe. So, in 2014, they released Dracula Untold. The film turned out to be a monumental failure, and Universal said, okay, let's just pretend that never happened. That was not the first movie in the franchise. We're just going to ignore it completely and actually start the universe with the next one, The Mummy. They cast Tom Cruise in it, and in fact, they had this huge announcement about the confirmed cast for the next movies. I mean, look at this photo. Javier Bardem, Sofia Boutella, Russell Crowe, Johnny Depp. They were so confident, weren't they? And then The Mummy opened in 2017, and it was a monumental failure. All the future plans were scrapped, the casting was thrown out the window, and someone at Universal said, okay, listen, we need to rethink this whole thing. First off, we can't keep doing these $100 million huge movies with the hopes that something eventually sticks. We need to go smaller. And second, let's maybe forget the whole shared universe shtick for a second and just do standalone movies, and that way maybe they can be decent. So, going with these two principles, they partnered with Blumhouse. They went back to the smaller horror roots of the monsters and made The Invisible Man as a standalone film. And actually, the result is pretty decent. So the film stars Elizabeth Moss as Cecilia, who at the beginning of the film escapes from her abusive husband slash tech giant Adrian. She then stays at the house of her friend James, played by Aldis Hodge. Still dealing with the trauma and the paranoia, she even fears just going outside to the mailbox because she's convinced Adrian will come for her. Then 2 weeks later, she learns that he's apparently committed suicide. He has left her an allowance of a couple $1,000,000, but she may lose it if she commits any crimes or is deemed mentally unsound. Cecilia visibly relaxes upon hearing this news and is sort of able to start breathing again, start living again. But then weird things start happening all around her, and she becomes convinced that Adrian isn't actually dead, that he faked the suicide, and he's using his experience in the field of optics. He has figured out a way to become invisible and is now haunting her. Now, obviously, to the outside world, this looks like another stage of paranoia, and even though we as an audience know that something is amiss, we are left together with Cecilia to try and figure out what's going on exactly and hopefully be able to prove it before it drives her mad. So the premise is pretty simple, and I'd say that the story does take a few shortcuts. At some point there are maybe even some plot holes in it that don't really make sense. It doesn't really concern itself, the film I mean, it doesn't really concern itself with deep backstories, subplots or character exploration. It's just the bare bones of a story. Woman stalked by an invisible man. But I have to say, it still manages to be quite entertaining because of the execution. I was able to look past the imperfections and holes because I was having such a good time. I think that the first thing that the film does very well is play with tension. In most of the scenes, we don't actually see the invisible man, obviously, and are left guessing, is he there now or not? Is he in this spot or in this spot, or maybe he left the room completely? That leads to very simple cinematic techniques that work quite well. For example, we'll have the music cue and the camera work suggests that there's going to be a jump scare right now, and then there isn't. And then maybe again this time, and nothing again. And then we relax, and the next time, boom, there is actually a jump scare. And it's so effective because of all this teasing before. So yes, there are jump scares, but which I typically hate, but they are used very cleverly, the way they should be, and they're not the sole cause of tension and fear in the film. By the way, I wouldn't classify the film as a straight horror. I think to me it's more of a psychological thriller. Going back to the simple filmmaking, the majority of the film is just the protagonist being scared that something may or may not be there. Now, if you do that, the weight of the movie rests primarily on the actor's shoulders, on the actor's ability to convey that terror. Fortunately, Elizabeth Moss is terrific in it, completely believable in every emotion she's going through. She has a pretty expressive face, and I think the movie, in a lot of ways, trusts her to do the talking without words, without dialogue. We don't need her to say how she feels because she shows it. Then there's also Aldis Hodge playing James, the friend, who I thought was equally amazing as this straight man to all this insanity that's going on. Like Cecilia, I had not a single doubt about his character. I thought he was written and performed very well, and without that, without having someone coming from a place of support but also skepticism, and sort of ground the events by reacting to them, it wouldn't have been as effective. Going back to the general topic of the story again, while I thought that some of the twists and turns were very predictable, there are a few moments in the film which did make me go, holy shit, this was bold. I did not expect that. So, yes, it does manage to surprise the audiences as well. It also has an extremely satisfying ending, but what's important is that because of a certain character being there, it's not just pure satisfaction, there's also a little bit of terror left in there in those final shots. A nice touch for the finish, not to go all out in one direction. So yeah, The Invisible Man turned out to be pretty cool indeed. I know after all this praise it may sound like I absolutely loved it, which is probably not true. As I said, the movie is simple to the point of being simplistic and painted in broad strokes, and it has its flaws and it's very far from perfect, and I'll probably not be watching it again. But despite all that, I think it managed to achieve its own goals to be an entertaining and effective thriller with solid acting and solid tension play. I enjoyed it for what it was.